Emily had already placed one foot on the edge of the bridge railing, her eyes fixed on the cold water below. But just then the man who had just returned from the military appeared behind her. He said only one sentence, and the entire bridge fell silent. What did he say that made her let go? Of despair. No one was waiting for him. No one knew he was coming home. The bus stopped quietly, as if it understood that this soldier didn't need a welcome, only to set foot again on the old ground. Richard Walker stepped down with a faded military backpack slung over one shoulder. His right hand still instinctively gripped the strap, while his left held a crumpled discharge letter. It had been 2 years and 8 months since he received orders to deploy to the northern border. The night he left, his daughter had just turned 7. Now she was 9, and Richard didn't know if she would even recognize him. A soldier coming home always brings 2 things with him: a quiet mind and a heart that has once been torn in half. The road back to the suburbs felt longer than he remembered. Stores closed earlier, fences had rusted, fruit stands no longer showed prices. Willow Creek City still looked the same, but his loved ones no longer lived at the same address. His mother had moved in with his ex-wife after he left. That woman, his second wife, had never been warm, but Richard believed she would at least provide Emily a roof and some stability. As he approached Maple Bridge, the one that crossed the dry creek each summer, Richard suddenly heard hushed voices. He looked up. A small crowd had gathered at the center of the bridge. All eyes were fixed on one point. No one dared to get closer. "What's happening now?" a man whispered. "She's been standing there for a while. Did anyone call the police?" a woman murmured behind Richard. A little boy clutched his mother's hand, staring toward the bridge. "She's gonna jump, Mom." Richard made his way through the crowd just in time to see a small figure teetering on the edge of the railing. The girl said nothing. She wasn't crying, just stood there, frail hair stuck to her face, barefoot, clutching the iron rail as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling into the empty space below. Her dark t-shirt clung to a body as thin as a reed. The hem was stained with dirt. Faint bruises marked her wrists. Her legs trembled slightly, whether from fear or having stood too long on the cold concrete, it wasn't clear. Richard narrowed his eyes. In that moment, it wasn't her posture or clothes that froze him in place, it was her eyes. That familiar deep gaze that had once been etched into his soul like ink bleeding through an old letter. A look that only someone who had ever sung a child to sleep could recognize in a heartbeat. "Emily." His voice caught in his throat. The girl didn't react. A breeze lifted strands of her hair. She raised her head. It was her. There was no mistaking it anymore. That face, that nose, the way her brow furrowed when confused, it was all there, fragile and heartbreaking. "Emily!" Richard called again, this time louder. She turned toward him. Her eyes widened as if unwilling to believe what they were seeing. No screams, no sobs, just silence screaming between them. "You," she finally said. "Who are you?" A child who has forgotten her father's face, has lived too long in absence. Richard took a small step forward. His voice was low but firm. "It's me. I'm your dad. I'm Richard." Emily pressed her lips together. Her hands still clung to the railing. She lowered her head, struggling internally. The crowd behind them held their breath. No one dared interrupt. Someone began filming, but even they weren't sure whether they were capturing a miracle or a tragedy. "You were gone a long time," her voice trembled. "I thought you forgot about me." Richard didn't explain. He didn't mention deployments, borders, or days filled with gunfire, because for a 9-year-old child, those things weren't the language of love. He simply slipped off his backpack, set it down, and stepped a little closer. Her shirt was soaked with sweat and torn at the side. He didn't ask where she had come from, why she was there, or how she had lived these past 2 years. He said just one thing. "You don't have to stand there anymore. I'm back. I came to take you home." Emily began to cry, not loudly, not in sobs, just tears falling quietly, unstoppable. "I'm sorry. I didn't know where to go. I had nowhere to sleep last night. They kicked me away from the porch." Richard's heart sank. He reached out gently as if offering her the entire world. "Come with me. We'll figure out the rest." Emily hesitated. She let go of one hand, then the other. Her first step was unsteady. But when she reached his chest, it was no longer a step. She collapsed. Her tiny frame folded into his arms, like a bird that had finally found rest after a storm too long. You're really my dad, right? Her voice cracked. I am, no one else. He wrapped her tightly in his embrace. The crowd began to step back. Someone wiped their eyes. An older man whispered, "Thank God." No one clapped. No one cheered. Because a reunion between father and daughter isn't a triumph. It's redemption. And sometimes redemption comes too late. Richard's wristwatch had stopped ticking a long time ago, but he still wore it every day. Not to tell time, but because on the back it bore an engraving of his daughter's name, Emily, as a quiet reminder that even if time itself came to a halt, a father was not allowed to. He crouched on the stone bench under the awning of the corner store, where the sunlight was just warm enough to mask the bruises on the girl's face. Emily leaned into him, his thin shirt draped over her shoulders like an old umbrella that couldn't quite block the chill from within. Out by the bridge, the police cruiser was still parked in place. One officer was speaking into his radio, while the other walked over holding a freshly printed file in hand. "We need a few more minutes to confirm with the Civil Registry Office, Mr. Walker. The girl has no recent school records and isn't listed under any health insurance." He nodded. "I brought the old family registry, her birth certificate, and the guardianship papers from 6 years ago. She's my biological daughter." The officer flipped through the documents and furrowed his brow. "The guardianship was court-approved after her mother passed away, correct?" "No," Richard replied, trying to steady his voice. "It was before she passed. We divorced when Emily was 3. Her mother had custody, but after the car accident, I was granted temporary care. After that," he didn't continue. He didn't need to. They had all the paperwork. What needed resolving now wasn't on paper. It was the child beside him, shivering silent, and clearly no longer trusting anything that called itself an adult. Once the officers stepped away to wait for verification, Richard remained seated beside his daughter. A gust of wind blew one of Emily's strands of hair across his face, carrying the scent of dust, a trace of child's sweat, and something stranger, the scent of fear. He gently pulled her closer, rubbing her icy hands with his. "You were living with Grandma and your stepmother, right?" he asked, using a soft tone, the kind people use to tell bedtime stories, even though it felt like stepping barefoot on glass. Emily shook her head. "Grandma's gone." Richard froze. He had never been told that. The girl looked down lightly, scratching her palm with her fingernails. "Miss Lorraine said I couldn't go to school anymore. She said I didn't obey. She made me sweep, mop, wash dishes. If it wasn't clean, I didn't get to eat." Her voice was flat without tears, as if she had replayed the story so many times in her head it had worn smooth. He listened, his chest tightening. This wasn't neglect. This was cruelty dressed up as family. Lorraine Campbell, his second wife. The woman who once swore she would never touch Emily unless she truly loved her. The woman who cried the day she moved into his house saying, "I won't be one of those fairy tale stepmoms. I'll be your friend." So this is what friendship looked like. An old newspaper vendor, Leonard Doyle, who had been lingering nearby, stepped forward. His voice was dry and low, like desert wind rustling through a northern plain. "Sorry to intrude, son." Richard gave a small nod, and the old man continued before he could reply. "I recognize the girl. Since the beginning of this year, she's been showing up at the corner market every afternoon. Never begged, just stood near the fried bread stall, waiting for someone to toss leftovers. One day she got yelled at for taking crusts without asking, ran, fell, scraped her knee bad. I offered her water, but she wouldn't take it, just said, 'I'll get punished if I'm late.'" He paused, eyes downcast. I thought about calling child services, but then, well, we're all busy, aren't we? That kind of busy. It makes people look the other way, even at a child." Richard nodded again faintly. He didn't blame the old man. Something heavier than anger stirred inside him, the helplessness of a father robbed of his right to protect his child by the very system he once trusted. At the county hospital, the sterile mix of rubbing alcohol and floor disinfectant made Emily recoil. She pulled back the moment she saw the silhouette of someone in a white coat approach. "You're okay, sweetheart." "It's just the doctor," Richard said, holding her hand. "Don't let them touch me," Emily whispered. "They'll get mad. They'll punish me." The sentence made the doctor freeze mid-step, her brow creasing. She was a small-framed woman, gray-streaked hair pulled back neatly, eyes sharp beneath calm features. "Your name's Emily, right?" she asked, kneeling to the girl's eye level. "I'm not someone who wants to scare you, but I need to help, just to check if anything hurts." Emily shook her head and clung tighter to Richard. "I'll stay right here. I'm not going anywhere," he said. She gave a tiny nod. For the first time since they'd found her, Emily allowed someone else to touch her. After a thorough examination, the doctor returned to Richard. Her face didn't betray emotion, but her tone was firm enough to send a cold wave down his spine. "The girl has multiple bruises on her arms and legs. There's a healed cut behind her ear, likely from blunt force or hair pulling. Her wrist was broken at some point, but never treated properly. It healed off-center, possibly from 3 to 4 months ago." "Could she have fallen?" Richard asked quietly, clinging to a fragile thread of hope. "There are no signs of natural falls. These are repeated injuries. They could have occurred over several months, maybe even a year." Emily sat motionless on the chair. No more reactions. She had learned to survive in silence. Richard felt small suddenly, like a father who arrived too late now, trying to gather pieces that never should have shattered in the first place. On the way home, he pulled over near an abandoned gas station surrounded by old oak trees. Emily wasn't asleep, but her eyes were heavy. Richard opened the trunk, pulled out a thick, worn coat, and draped it gently over her. "You cold? No. Don't go anywhere, Dad. I'm not going anywhere. I promise." It was the first time in years he used that word, Dad, and the first time in a very long time Emily wasn't afraid to hear it. Life isn't always a matter of choosing right from wrong. Sometimes it's the courage to stand up after you weren't fast enough to stop something terrible. Richard knew he couldn't rewrite the past, but from the moment Emily took his hand on that bridge, he had chosen to be silent no longer. No one would ever hurt her again, not even someone who dared to call herself his wife. Some people spend their whole lives trying to paint over their words as if sweet enough speech could cover the cracks in the truth. But no matter how many coats of polish you apply, you can't hide the rot of a wall already split from the inside. Interrogation room 2 had gone quiet. No more tapping on the table. No one had taken a sip of water in minutes. A 2-minute audio recording had just finished playing, and its echoes still hung in the air. Not because it had been loud, but because it had been real, too real for any of the 3 people in the room to look at each other for too long. The only woman in the room leaned slightly back in her chair. Lorraine Campbell wore a beige blazer, her wavy hair styled neatly, her lips bright red as if freshly touched up. She wasn't flustered. She simply exhaled lightly, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "It's really unfortunate to see my ex-husband resorting to such cheap tactics," she said, "even dragging the neighbors into this." She smiled, though the smile never reached her eyes. "As you all know, it's quite easy these days to fabricate voices. I'm afraid that recording isn't admissible." No one responded immediately. Only the sound of the police chief's pen tapping against the folder. After a few seconds, he spoke in a voice calm but firm. "Ms. Campbell, by procedure, an audio recording is considered supportive evidence. But if it aligns with witness statements and signs of injury on the child, we have reason to conduct a serious investigation." Lorraine tilted her head slightly. "And who is this witness? That old woman behind the gas station? She fed Emily twice and suddenly thinks she's the fairy godmother." "That's enough," said Richard Walker, who had been silent until then. His voice was low and hoarse, restrained, but each word came through clearly. "You don't need to insult others to justify yourself." Lorraine raised an eyebrow, then turned to the man beside her. "Mr. Monroe, I think I've heard enough." David Monroe, her attorney, tall and thin, somewhere past 50, had maintained a cool, distant demeanor from the start. He opened his briefcase, pulled out a thin stack of papers, and slid them across the table toward the police. "Ladies and gentlemen, under the Child Protection Act, I represent Ms. Campbell in requesting a review of Mr. Richard Walker's custodial rights. He abandoned his daughter to enlist in the military, sent no support, made no contact for nearly 6 years. Furthermore, we have psychological records indicating that Emily has exhibited signs of self-harm. Any bruises she may have could very well be self-inflicted. And what about the recording?" Richard's voice was controlled but carried weight. "We will request forensic analysis," Monroe replied. "But as Ms. Campbell already mentioned, modern technology offers countless ways to create such recordings. Outside in the hallway, a staff member from the legal department stepped in and whispered a few words to the lead officer. The officer nodded slightly and addressed the room. "We've just received the pediatrician's report from the emergency room visit yesterday. Emily has a total of 8 bruises, a laceration along her rib cage, and older injuries that haven't fully healed. More importantly, the pattern of the injuries is consistent with being struck by a flat object. Self-inflicted. Not impossible. But for an 8-year-old child, the angle of contact doesn't match." Monroe furrowed his brow but said nothing. Lorraine stayed composed, her smile thin. "You think I'm that kind of person? A devoted stepmother who gave up her own career to care for her husband's daughter now accused of abuse." Richard's voice dropped cold and precise. "You're not her mother. You never once held her, not even when she had a fever and was shaking." The room tensed. It was hard for a father to sit there and listen to someone accuse him of abandonment, especially when he was the one who had found his daughter shivering inside a garbage bin. The police presented a temporary measure. "We propose placing Emily in the care of Child Protective Services while the case is reviewed. The initial holding period is 7 days, extendable to 30. Richard stood abruptly. "If you need my cooperation, you have it. Documents, I'll provide them. Home inspection, I'm ready. But my daughter doesn't need another temporary shelter. She needs the truth and someone to protect her. That person is me." His voice wasn't loud, but no one in the room spoke against him after that. The lead officer turned to the representative from Child Protective Services. "Based on the available evidence, the medical report and current health condition of the child, we propose temporarily granting Mr. Richard Walker custody of Emily for 30 days under supervised monitoring." As Richard signed the receipt form, he felt his hand tremble not from fear, but from the weight of emotion pressing in. He knew the road ahead was long, but at least tonight he wouldn't walk out of the police station alone. Emily sat curled up on a chair in the corner of the waiting room, clutching a worn, stuffed bear. When she saw Richard step out, she didn't run into his arms. She simply rose quietly and walked beside him like 2 small shadows emerging from the dark. On the way home, Richard didn't turn on the radio. Inside the car, there was only the sound of the air conditioner and the steady breathing of his daughter. Behind the wheel, he spoke softly. "They'll come back. But next time we won't be alone." Emily turned to him, her voice barely louder than the wind slipping through a crack in the window. "Dad, do you believe I'm not lying?" He didn't answer with words. He simply reached over and placed his hand gently over hers. "I believe you, Emily, and I won't let anyone hurt you ever again." In a quiet corner of an old neighborhood behind a small paper flower shop, Mrs. Helen Whitaker was cleaning a modest altar she kept for her late husband. She sighed softly as she wiped the picture frame, her hands never stopping. "God may be slow," she whispered, "but he never forgets. Those who sow the wind will one day pay with the storm." And somewhere else in the city, Lorraine poured herself a glass of red wine but didn't drink it. The apartment lights shone brightly, yet they couldn't hide something creeping quietly into her eyes, unease. People don't fear the dark because there's no light, but because once the light went out exactly when they needed it most. Emily stood behind Richard, silent and still. She was small, like a shadow lingering after a storm. Inside that old house, no one needed to mention the past. It still lived in every crack along the walls, in every creak of the floorboards when someone accidentally stepped on a memory not yet at rest. Richard stopped in front of the second door down the hall. Without looking at the girl, he turned the handle and pushed the door open carefully, as if whatever was inside might break. And truthfully, it might. The room wasn't bigger than 2 dining tables put together. The walls had been repainted a soft, pale blue. In one corner stood a twin bed with white sheets dotted with little orange circles. On top of it sat a brand new stuffed bear, faintly scented with fresh paper and a hint of cinnamon woven into the fabric. A small bookshelf stood empty beside it. A nightlight shaped like a crescent moon glowed gently in the corner. Emily took half a step into the room. Her eyes didn't blink. She didn't run over like an excited child. She didn't ask what the bear's name was. She just looked around for a long moment, then asked quietly, "Does this room lock from the inside?" Richard turned. He wasn't surprised, but a trace of pain crept into his voice. "Yes, and you have the key." Emily nodded and sat on the edge of the bed like she was testing foreign ground. She didn't touch the stuffed bear. She took off her backpack, placed it carefully in the corner, then walked to the door, turned the knob, and tested the lock. She said nothing after. That night, Richard heated water in the old guest bathroom at the back of the house. It hadn't been used in a while. He wiped down the mirror, laid out a fresh towel, and hung a soft t-shirt and long pants on a wooden hook. He called her in, holding the door open. Emily walked in slowly. When she saw steam rising from the tub, she froze. I don't need a bath." Her voice was soft, steady, and oddly controlled. It wasn't fear so much as a rehearsed response, like she had learned to say those words to avoid punishment. Richard didn't push her. He rested his hand on the doorframe, avoiding her eyes. "You could just soak your hands and feet a little. Warm water helps your body rest." Emily didn't reply. A moment later, she closed the door gently, so softly it barely made a sound. He sat just outside, listening to the water touch her skin, but then amidst the trickling sounds came a whisper that struck him like a blow to the chest. "I've been good. Please don't make me take my clothes off. I'll be quiet, I promise." Richard snapped upright, eyes locked on the wooden door. His hand clenched involuntarily on his thigh. A cold breeze slipped through the cracks around the frame like a reminder that some wounds don't live on the skin. That night, he couldn't sleep. After almost an hour of sitting in silence, Richard picked up the phone and called Thomas, his old friend and former Army psychologist, now retired in Oregon. "There's something I don't know how to start talking about," he said. Then, "Just talk," came the calm voice on the other end. "I'm still awake. She's only 7. But in her words, I hear things even grown men wouldn't know how to survive." There was a pause, then Thomas spoke, his tone dropping low. "Trauma doesn't choose by age. The younger they are, the deeper it roots. You're not there to fix her in a week, not in a month. Just stay. Sit long enough that she knows no one will ever push her back into the dark again." "What if she never lets me in?" Richard asked. "Then don't go in. Just stay by the door. Don't knock. One day when she's ready, she'll open it, and you'll be the first person she'll want to see." Near midnight, Richard was adjusting an old photo frame on the shelf when a sound came from Emily's room. It wasn't running feet or cries. It was a muffled, strangled shout from a nightmare. "Daddy, don't drink again. Please don't take the pills." He rushed in and opened the door. Emily sat bolt upright, eyes shut tight, arms clutching her head as if trying to erase something she couldn't unsee. Richard didn't call her name. He didn't touch her. He simply sat at the edge of her bed and said gently, "No one in this house takes pills. No one yells anymore." Emily opened her eyes in a start. The moon-shaped nightlight illuminated her face, revealing a line of tears down her cheek. But she didn't scream, didn't recoil. She just breathed hard. "Here. The door locks now, right?" "Yes," Richard answered. "You hold the key, and even if you fall asleep, it stays locked." She looked at him for a few seconds longer, then laid back down, wrapping her arms around the stuffed bear she hadn't touched all day. In its silent, worn embrace, the bear said nothing, but it held onto a warmth that adults too often forget to give. Early morning wind slipped through the wooden window frame, carrying with it the damp scent of the old poplar tree outside the porch. The leaves quivered slightly, as if trying to hold on to the first rays of sunlight, breaking through the lingering mist on the ground. In the small kitchen, the kettle clicked softly, its sound a gentle reminder that a new day had begun. Richard Walker was still asleep. He lay motionless on the old sofa, the thin blanket having slipped off his shoulder at some unknown point in the night. One hand still rested on an open notebook, the ink from last night's writing not yet completely dry. Emily sat at her study desk, elbows on the surface, fingers absent-mindedly tracing vague circles on a blank page. She had been awake for quite a while, not from a nightmare, but from something closer to anticipation. On the table next to a blue eraser and a pencil with a broken tip lay a brand new notebook, its first page still untouched. Richard stirred awake at the sound of her sigh. He rubbed his eyes, walked over and pulled out a chair to sit beside her. He didn't need to ask. He knew today was the day Emily would start relearning her letters. "Where should we start?" he asked, voice still groggy with sleep, but his eyes were already clear and focused. Emily hesitated, then whispered, "The letter A, like a key." "Yes, that's good. A, like a key, like saying, 'I'm here.'" Richard smiled, his gaze directed not just at the letter, but at something deeper. He placed a fresh notebook on the table, the one he had carefully chosen from the stationery store down the block. It had a brown cover and thick paper that wouldn't glare under the yellow light. He had picked it with great care, not wanting a child who once feared the dark to feel intimidated by a page too white. "Try writing the letter A," he suggested. Emily picked up the pencil. Her small hand still trembled slightly, but the first letter appeared round and brave. Then came B, then C, and so on. Each letter took shape like tentative steps back into the world. By the fourth lesson, Richard started to see her smile more often. Simple questions like, "What's your favorite word today?" Or, "If you could color the whole world one color, what would it be?" seemed to help her unlock a door long closed. But that morning, as the two of them sat side by side at the table amid the rustle of pencils and the gentle sunlight streaming through the curtain, Emily looked up, her eyes shining like rain collected in an old wooden bucket. "Dad," she said, her voice barely audible, "I want to write a fairy tale, but without a princess." He put his pen down and leaned in slightly. "Then who will be in the story?" Emily furrowed her brow. "There's a little girl who lives in a room with no window. It's always dark in there. No one ever comes in, no one ever knocks. Each day all she hears are bottles falling to the floor and footsteps." Richard sat in silence. She didn't say me didn't recount her own story, but each word felt like it was tearing open a corner of a memory he wasn't sure he had the strength to face. He knew he wasn't hearing fiction. It was a sad parable, and the main character was the girl sitting right in front of him. Emily continued. "The woman who lives with the little girl, she drinks this brown liquid. I don't know what it's called. After drinking it, she yells, her hands get bigger and she stomps like a monster. The little girl is scared, but she can't run. There's no window, no way out." After that lesson, Richard stood a long time in front of the storage closet where he once kept his old military gear. Body armor medals, certificates all neatly tucked inside a wooden box. He had never opened it again, not because of painful memories, but because he no longer knew what purpose they served. On the battlefield, he knew how to react, when to drop low, when to advance. But in front of a child trying to rewrite her life from broken pieces, Richard felt like an apprentice never trained for this role. That night he took out his notebook and began to write. Not a diary, not a memoir, just simple lines to remind himself what truly mattered. Day 15. Emily spoke of a room without a window. "I understand now that it isn't just a place, it's a time. A part of her life was locked away, hidden, and now she's trying to write it down with trembling hands. I used to be a soldier, someone who survived the edge between life and death, but I never learned how to be a father." When Emily said, "I don't want a princess," I knew she wasn't looking for magic. She needed someone who wouldn't walk away from the truth. "I couldn't save Frank Collins in the B3 operation. I saw him fall under fire. I lived, but I didn't do what I should have. This time I can't stand still. I won't let a child write her fairy tale with tears." A few days later, Richard placed a blank sheet of paper in front of Emily. "Do you have a character yet?" he asked. Emily nodded. "Yes, a little owl named Thomas. He can't fly, but he hears really well. Every time the girl gets scared, he whispers in her ear, 'You're still here. No one can take you away.'" Richard smiled. "Then let little Thomas guard the story, and this time you get to write the ending." Someone who has been hurt isn't necessarily weak, but if they know how to sit quietly and listen to a child, maybe they've already begun to heal. The sound of the kitchen faucet was steady, but Richard's hands had stopped moving. Water trickled between his fingers, carrying the thin layer of soap suds reflecting the soft yellow light from above. Dishes remained in the sink half-washed, but he stood motionless, his head tilted slightly, eyes fixed on the far corner of the living room where a small fireplace still burned low. Emily was sitting there, not playing with her teddy bear like she usually did, not asking to watch cartoons or for extra cookies. She sat silently with her thick sketchbook on her lap, slowly coloring with a black pencil, occasionally adding streaks of deep blue. Her face was unusually serious. "I'm drawing you," Emily said suddenly, without looking up, her eyes still focused on the paper. "But not the dad you are now, the one from the bridge the first day I saw you." No sound came from him, but inside it felt as if something had quietly cracked. He slowly turned around, leaning his back against the edge of the sink, eyes following her every small movement. She was drawing him. Not as he was now with his neat haircut and clean shirt, but as he had been in that worn-out military uniform, standing still against the concrete railing, his eyes hollow as if all life had drained out of him. "You saw all of that?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Emily lifted her head and looked directly at him. "Yes, that day I was sleeping under the bridge. I heard your footsteps, and I saw you. You stood there for a long time. You didn't move. I didn't know what you were going to do, but it felt so cold and I was scared. Then I called out." Richard didn't respond. He walked slowly over, sat down in the old armchair across from the fireplace, resting his hands on his knees, his eyes on the drawing. She had captured that moment with a kind of perception no child should have. The man on the paper stood with slumped shoulders, head bowed, not someone living for anything anymore. "You shouldn't have seen that, Emily," he said quietly. "But I did," she replied, her hand continuing to draw. A long gray line extended behind the figure of the man like a shapeless void. A moment later, Emily asked a question that hit Richard like a punch to the chest, dragging him down to the darkest corner of memory. "Did you really want to die?" No excuses, no forced smile, no denial meant to ease things. Richard simply lowered his head. "I did. At that moment, I felt like I had no reason to stay. But then, I saw you, and you were the only reason I didn't go." Emily put down her pencil. She leaned forward and picked up a green crayon, but didn't draw with it. Instead, she quietly pulled the small blanket closer, then curled into Richard's arms in a gesture that was sudden but felt like it had always belonged. He wrapped his arms around her large, rough hands warm against her back. In that moment, Richard realized it wasn't just he who had lost his way. The child in his arms had also been searching for a path, back one uncertain step at a time. Emily whispered almost to herself, "I miss Mom, but I don't really remember her face anymore, just the white shirt she always wore with tiny red flowers." A chill crept up Richard's back, not from the room temperature, but from the quiet sorrow in that small voice. He looked down at her soft hair and said nothing that might sound empty. His silence was an apology for a past she never should have had to carry. "It's okay, Emily," he said softly after a while. "Some people stay in our hearts forever, even if their faces fade away." She nodded slightly, then leaned closer against his chest for the first time without hesitation. That night, the two of them laid a thick blanket in the middle of the living room. Richard brought over pillows from the sofa while Emily carried her teddy bear, a small book, and 2 pencils. No one mentioned going to bed. They just wanted to stay there next to the fire, where the flickering light painted quiet stories on the ceiling, stories long waiting to be spoken. Emily lay on her side, back turned to him, but her hand still touched his arm. "Dad, are you scared?" she asked softly, thinking he might already be asleep. "Scared of what, sweetheart?" "Scared that tomorrow won't be like today." He smiled, even as his eyes stung. "Yes, I am. But being scared doesn't mean we stop. It's okay to be afraid as long as we're still holding someone's hand while we move forward." Emily didn't answer, but her breathing grew deeper, steadier. Richard realized then a child doesn't need to know every painful detail to grow. What they need is just enough truth and love that never changes. In the corner of the room, the fire kept burning. Outside, the night had fully settled, wind passing under the eaves. But inside that small home, 2 souls had finally found each other again, through a drawing, the question never meant to be asked, and a gentle lean against a shoulder. Life doesn't always give us the chance to start over. But when someone small enough sees you more clearly than you see yourself, sometimes what you thought was the end turns out to be a new doorway. Not everyone who remains silent is heartless. Some people choose silence because they lack the courage to speak of a wound that's still bleeding. Richard couldn't remember how many times he had seen people close a chapter in their lives. Some sealed the past with a quiet nod. Some burned everything down, and some simply gathered the remnants into a box, taped it shut, and tucked it deep into a corner of the closet. Today, he held a box like that in his hands. Lieutenant Frank Collins handed it to him with a neutral expression. "Just a routine case," he said, "personal effects of the deceased." But Richard knew that anything connected to Daniel was never just routine, not for Emily, and certainly not for himself. He carried the box home as if it contained something that could still change the course of things. Emily sat at the dining table, her eyes hesitating when she saw him come in. "The police called me," Richard said. They returned a few belongings. From him. He didn't use the word stepfather. That word, after everything, still didn't belong in front of Emily. She didn't respond, but her eyes locked onto the box like there was something inside waiting to be named. Richard opened the lid. Inside were a few scattered items: an old scratched pocket watch, a set of keys to unknown locks, some faded receipts, and a stack of damp, stuck-together photographs. He carefully separated them, stopping when one slipped from the pile, a young woman with gently curled hair, standing in a flower garden, one hand resting on her pregnant belly. Her smile was tender, and her gaze toward the camera was full of quiet warmth. Emily walked closer. She didn't ask. She simply held out her hand. Richard silently gave her the photo. She stared at it as if she had never seen anyone like that before. "She's beautiful," Emily whispered, her lips barely moving. "If she was, why did she leave me?" The question wasn't really aimed at him, but it still cut straight through his chest. Richard had no idea how to respond. That question had circled in his own mind for years, only no one had ever dared to say it aloud. "I don't know," he said softly, still watching Emily's face. "But maybe not everyone who leaves really wanted to leave." Emily didn't reply, but her eyes never left the photo. Richard could see her silently asking that woman hundreds of questions at once, wanting to touch her skin, hear a real answer, not the kind adults give to soothe pain, but the truth. The next morning, Richard drove to the old maternity hospital in the city. The building was worn down, its walls cracked and faded, but the sign still read North Valley Medical Center. He was directed to the old records room where Dr. Margaret Dawson retired, but still occasionally helping out with sorting through dusty files. She was an older woman with firm eyes that hadn't dulled with age. When Richard mentioned the name Rachel Turner, she paused and looked up at him for a long moment. "She was admitted under emergency conditions 8 years ago," Richard said slowly. "And after that, no one ever mentioned her again." Dr. Dawson paused, pulled off her reading glasses, and opened a small yellowed notebook. "I remember that case," she began. "A young woman with abdominal trauma. There were signs of abuse, but she didn't say a word. Her face, her eyes haunted me. Like someone who knew she was about to lose something precious. Did you ever see her again, Dr. Dawson shook her head. "Less than 2 hours later, someone came with transfer papers. All documents were in order, but the process was rushed. We didn't even get a chance to run any tests. She was taken somewhere else. No contact info left behind. Do you remember who came for her?" She thought for a long moment. A woman. Tall, straightened hair, heavy makeup. She brought a marriage certificate with her. The husband's name was Daniel Campbell. The woman who signed the forms, her name was Lorraine. The room fell into silence for a few seconds. Richard didn't say a word. But inside, the pieces began to fall into place. He remembered how Lorraine used to get jealous over names no one even mentioned anymore. He remembered how Emily would accidentally call her mom and get punished for it. He remembered the ripped-up photographs, the old things of Rachel's that were never seen again. "Is it possible?" Emily's mother was forced to leave, he asked in a low voice. "Doctor." Dawson sighed, looking out the window. "I've worked in this field for 30 years. Some women don't come to the hospital to give birth. They come because they're being made to give something up." That evening, Richard placed the photograph on the table. Emily sat across from him, clutching her worn stuffed bear, her eyes following every move he made. "I found out a few things," he said gently. "Your mom was admitted to the hospital in bad shape. After that, someone else may have forced her to leave." Emily lowered her head, gripping the hem of her shirt tightly. If she didn't want to leave me, why didn't she ever come back? Richard sat down beside her, speaking softly. Maybe she tried, but maybe someone made it impossible. Sometimes people don't walk away because they want to. They walk because there's nowhere left to go. Emily didn't cry. But when she turned the photo toward the light, Richard saw tiny droplets fall onto the corner of the picture. "I won't ask her why anymore," Emily whispered. "If I ever see her again, I'll just ask if she was ever scared." The words left Richard breathless. He stood up and walked to the window, tightening his grip around the photo frame. That night, he opened the old notebook he had long ago tucked away with memories too heavy to carry. On the first page, he wrote, "Some stories are not cut short because they've ended, but because someone was never allowed to finish telling them. But this time, I will, and I'll tell it with the truth. I don't need anything, just Dad." The words scribbled in purple pencil on a piece of lined school paper folded 4 times had its corners curled from sweaty little hands. The man placed it in front of the judge without saying a word. Nothing speaks deeper than the raw voice of a child afraid of being taken away from the only person she calls home. No one in the courtroom dared to speak. Not because of emotion, but because sometimes truth needs nothing more than silence to strip away every excuse. Richard Walker wasn't wearing a suit or tie. His shirt sleeves were wrinkled at the cuffs and his eyes sunken from too many sleepless nights. But he stood tall without flinching. Each step from the defendant's seat to the center of the room felt like retracing the last 8 months of his life since the day he held Emily in his arms beneath the first rain of the season, to this very moment, standing here to keep her from being returned to a house that had shattered her soul. On the opposite side sat Lorraine Campbell, wrapped in a beige scarf. Her eyes no longer carried the softness she reserved for media appearances. In the newspapers, she was still referred to as the grieving mother who lost her child. But in this courtroom, that grief was weighed with evidence, not with tears in front of a camera. "Your Honor," Lorraine's attorney spoke up, "my client has suffered significant trauma, and for 2 years she was prevented from seeing her daughter. Mr. Walker's previous suicide attempt, as recorded by a clinical report, clearly indicates psychological instability." No one mentioned that Lorraine hadn't once visited Emily during nearly the first year the girl stayed with Richard. No one brought up how the girl used to wake up sobbing in the middle of the night whenever she heard high heels tapping on the tile floor, a small sound that reopened the deepest cuts. Mr. Walker, the middle-aged judge, finally looked up. "Do you have any response to the concern raised about your mental health?" Richard didn't answer immediately. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his pocket, opening it with the same care someone might open a faded photograph. He looked up. His voice was hoarse but steady. "I don't think there's much I need to defend. I was broken, yes. But no one is born knowing how to be a father. You learn bit by bit, with every meal prepared, with every time you place a hand on a fevered forehead. I only have one thing to say. The person who needs to be heard here isn't me. It's her." He placed the paper down and stepped back. The room fell still. The letter was from Emily, and everyone recognized her handwriting the moment they saw it. "I don't want to go back to the house where nobody talks." The childlike scrawl wasn't angry, wasn't accusatory, didn't even place blame. And perhaps that was exactly why it pierced so deeply. A house without voices. What kind of place is that? From the second row, Emily clutched Mrs. Helen Whitaker's hand tightly. She didn't understand every part of the proceedings, but she could feel the heavy tension surrounding her father. That morning before leaving their apartment, she had asked hesitantly, "If I mess up, will they make me go back to her?" Helen hadn't answered right away. Some questions, even from children, cannot be promised lightly. Instead, she bent down and whispered in Emily's ear, almost like talking to herself. Grown-ups sometimes make a lot of noise to hide the truth. But children, they stay quiet and still manage to say the right thing. Dr. Margaret Dawson arrived right on time, her gray hair pulled into a neat bun and white coat folded crisply in hand. She had been the first physician to examine Emily when Richard brought her to the clinic. Her testimony was concise, factual, and professional, clear signs of emotional neglect and long-term psychological trauma. But when asked, "Do you believe Mr. Walker is fit to care for the child?" she paused before answering. No one is ever truly fit by the standard of money or status, but if we measured it by the number of times he came back to the hospital to ask if a certain food would be okay for her condition, I'd say I've never seen a father more devoted. The last to speak was Dr. Thomas Grant, the psychologist who had been monitoring Richard for 6 months following his personal crisis. His report concluded that there were no remaining signs of clinical depression. He added, without reading from notes, "Rather than say, Richard is healed, I'd say this: he's chosen to live every single day for someone else." The courtroom door hadn't even fully closed when a police officer entered. He handed a sealed envelope to the court clerk and leaned in to whisper something to the judge. The judge furrowed his brow, then turned toward Lorraine. "Mrs. Campbell, are you aware of an anonymous letter that was sent to Emily's biological mother shortly before her disappearance?" Lorraine froze. Her eyes lost direction. We've just received forensic confirmation. That letter contains biological traces matching your file. Lorraine's attorney began to rise, presumably to object, but the judge raised a hand signaling for silence. We will adjourn for further examination of this new evidence. However, until an official ruling is made, Mr. Walker's temporary guardianship will remain in effect. Emily didn't catch everything that was said, but she saw her father's face soften. Slowly, she rose from her seat, gently slipping her hand out of Mrs. Whitaker's and walked toward the bright open hallway. She looked up and asked quietly, "Dad, are we still getting egg sandwiches today?" Richard crouched down and patted her gently on the head. "My princess, today, you get to pick the milkshake too," an old man once said. "There are courtrooms not meant to settle who's right or wrong, but to help people remember what matters most. And in a room where children's voices are too often overlooked, this time a handwritten letter said everything that needed to be heard. There are some things we cannot force through words or paperwork. They can only be quietly planted into time, like seeds in the hands of a patient gardener. And some children, they only need one look that does not abandon them to know they belong somewhere." Richard Walker had never imagined a day would come when his hand would hold a document titled Official Custody Order. He only thought simply he would stay until the girl no longer needed him. But in that moment, standing in court, hearing the judge read Emily's name with his own surname, something quietly bloomed inside him. Like an old door opening again, letting light come in gently without noise. No one called ahead. There was no celebration, no bouquet of flowers, just Richard returning quietly to the house where everything had begun. A bag of pastries tucked under one arm, few hurried drawings in his coat pocket, and a folded document wrapped in his late wife's handkerchief. The only thing he had kept all these years. Emily was sitting in the temporary study room, a space that had been nothing more than a forgotten storage area a few months ago. She tilted her head, focused on the blank page, a green crayon in her hand. On the table sat a half-finished cartoon character above which was scribbled "The Father on the Bridge." Richard didn't interrupt or speak. He simply placed the pastry bag on the table and quietly sat beside her. After a moment, Emily turned to him, her eyes silently questioning. "You're back?" "Yes." The reply was short, but it came with a gentle gesture. He handed her the item wrapped in the handkerchief. Emily opened it slowly. It was a newly printed birth certificate. The box for biological father was filled in Richard Walker. She held the paper with both hands, clutching it tightly. Her eyes blinked a few times as if making sure she wasn't dreaming. Then, without another word, she hugged him. It wasn't a lonely hug nor a hesitant one. "Can I stay here? Forever?" Richard didn't answer with words. He gently patted her back, holding her as if something precious might vanish if he let go. People often say you can fix a house with money, but a home needs hearts that cherish each other. From that day on, the house began to change little by little, not with new paint or furniture, but with breath. Emily painted a small wooden sign and hung it outside the study room, the words scrawled in crayon, "This is my world." Richard saw it and only smiled quietly, adding a new desk lamp. In the back of the house, he cleaned out his late wife's old room. He had not dared to open it for years. Now it became Emily's room for reading and drawing. Morning light shone in, making the paintings she had taped to the walls glow. She arranged her colored pencils like toys, each with a name. One was Sunshine, another Chubby Cat, and one was named Richard. One afternoon, Richard came home and smelled the aroma of herbs from the kitchen. Martha Doyle, the longtime housekeeper, stood with arms folded, watching Emily fussing over a pot of soup. "I didn't touch that pot, sir," she said, clicking her tongue. "She insisted on cooking alone. Even asked me what your favorite soup was." Emily didn't turn around. She simply tasted the soup with a spoon and nodded like a little chef. "We made Richard soup." "You better eat it all, Dad." Richard froze for a few seconds at the word Dad so naturally spoken. He looked at Martha Doyle, then at the girl. No one said anything, but something settled inside him, more solid than a birth certificate. At night, Richard still checked every window, not because of thieves, but out of habit from the days when no one else lived there. But now, in a room at the end of the hallway, the moon-shaped nightlight still glowed, and he heard the even, steady breathing of his daughter, deeper than on any night before. One Sunday morning, while organizing his desk, Richard found a bundle of papers neatly placed on top of his old notebook. The cover had a drawing of a bridge and a man standing in the middle of it. The first line read, "The Father on the Bridge," a short story by Emily Walker. In the story, the father didn't speak beautiful words. He just stood there every day under harsh sun or light rain so that his daughter would know if she looked up, someone would be waiting. Even if she stepped wrong, fell back, or was pushed by the world, the bridge and the father would still be there. Richard didn't read it aloud. He folded the story, placed it back exactly where it had been, and stepped outside into the yard. He didn't need praise. He didn't need anyone to understand. He just needed her to keep writing and to keep living. That night he stood silently before the old photo hanging upstairs. The woman in it still looked gentle, just like back then. Her eyes seemed to look through the frame, straight into his soul. "You can rest now. Our daughter is still alive, and she's really living." A soft rustle behind him. Emily stood at the staircase holding a pillow, her hair tousled, eyes still sleepy. "You're not sleeping yet. I was just talking to your mom for a bit." Emily came closer and stood beside him. After a moment, she whispered, "I think the bridge in the story needs a garden, so that anyone who crosses will feel more at peace." Richard smiled. For the first time in years, he didn't feel a cold draft standing before that room. "I'll buy some seeds tomorrow, but they need to be flowers that bloom all year." Emily nodded. "Then I'll write the next part. It's called The Father Who Planted a Garden for the Lost Children." Richard looked at his daughter. Not the way an adult looks at a child, but the way a man listens to a young writer sharing a newly blooming dream. A home is not made of roofs, bricks, or locked doors. It is the place where no matter how many storms life throws at you, someone will be there waiting with the door open. And the moment Emily called him Dad with such ease, that old house became a home. Emily walked beside Richard without saying a word. Their uneven footsteps along the worn dirt path created a muted rhythm, as if the two of them were retracing an old memory too fragile to describe. Every now and then she glanced down at her shoes, then at the hand holding hers so firmly. This wasn't the first time they held hands, but some handholds were just gestures, and some were promises. At that moment, Emily no longer felt like her father's hand was trying to keep her from falling, but rather walking with her towards something both of them had avoided for too long. As they approached the old wooden bridge, Richard slowed his pace. He wasn't walking slower exactly, but his steps showed hesitation. The bridge looked the same as always, low railing, a splintered section on one side. Maybe someone had struck it once, or maybe time itself had stripped away its strength. Beneath the bridge, the stream still flowed, indifferent to who stood above it. Emily gently slipped her hand free, not to pull away, but to step forward. She walked right to the same spot she once stood, where the wind had once stung her face, where one sentence had changed everything. She stood there a moment, her hand resting on the railing. Then she turned her eyes, locking onto the man who had waited for her to grow up with all the patience a lifetime could gather. "Do you remember this place, Dad?" Richard nodded slowly. "I remember." He stepped up beside her, needing no explanation for why Emily wanted to come back here. A father doesn't have to understand everything, just be in the right place at the right time. Emily whispered, "If you hadn't said anything that day, I think I really would have jumped." A strong gust blew through, scattering her hair before it fell gently back onto her small shoulders. Emily wasn't looking for a reply. She was finally peeling back a scar that had waited long enough to breathe. Richard didn't answer right away. He leaned on the railing, eyes following the stream. After a while, his voice came low and steady. "Back then, if you hadn't been here, I might have jumped too." No one would be surprised by such a confession. Those who've stood at the edge of despair know they've often been closer to each other than they realized. The only difference is that day, someone called out and someone stopped. Emily looked at her father. For the first time, she no longer saw them as two separate people struggling alone against the world. They had once stood on opposite ends of this bridge, but now they stood together at the center, where no one had to jump to end the pain. "I have a letter." Emily reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small glass jar. Inside was a tightly rolled piece of paper, like a quiet secret, a prayer not meant for anyone she knew. Richard said nothing as he watched her open the lid and place the jar carefully at the base of the railing near the splintered wood. Emily knelt down and adjusted it, making sure it could be seen but not easily picked up unless someone truly needed it. I wrote it last week, she said. But today, I finally knew where to leave it. Richard asked softly, "What did you write?" Emily didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on the jar as if whispering to it, "To anyone who thinks they have no one left, if someone like me can keep going, you can too." The answer left Richard speechless. Not because it shocked him, but because he realized Emily finally understood. It wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about choosing to live. Some would call that courage. Others would call it a miracle. But to Richard, it was the most sacred thing he'd ever witnessed, a child choosing to forgive what once made her want to die. They stood together in silence, both gazing at the small jar below. "Do you think anyone will pick it up, Dad?" "Maybe not," Richard answered. Then he turned toward her and added gently, "But if someone needs it, they'll find it." Emily nodded and took a step back. "I think I'll write more. Leave a few more jars. Maybe one day, another kid will find one." "And they won't jump," Richard said for her. No explanation was needed. Just a jar, a letter, a moment of sharing. Sometimes that's all it takes to keep someone here. Back in Emily's room, a soft lamp now glowed beside her bed. On the bookshelf, tucked among old books and childhood photo boxes, she had hung two portraits. One was of her mother, gentle eyes, round face, and a quiet smile that seemed to whisper something only the two of them understood. The other was of Richard, taken the day he waited outside her school after her first semester exam, holding a tissue and a lollipop. Beneath the two photos hung a small wooden frame where Emily had carved the words, "Herself." "No one can replace Mom, but no one can take my heart unless I choose to give it again." Those words weren't meant for anyone else. They were for Emily, the girl who once locked her heart away, now learning to open it, not because someone deserved it, but because she herself deserved peace. People often think a closed door means the end. But sometimes a door is only closed to keep the wind out. And if you're brave enough to knock again, it might just lead you somewhere you never expected. 10 years later, Emily was now a young woman of 19. No longer the trembling little girl who once stood on the wooden bridge, yet something in her eyes remained quiet and resolute, like a lantern placed inside a wind cage, once shaken but never extinguished. She returned to that bridge one late spring afternoon. In her hand was a new glass jar. Inside was no longer a letter scrawled in shaky handwriting, but clean, rounded script written with the calmness that only time can teach. Richard no longer walked as quickly as he used to, but he still walked every step beside his daughter. The same back that had once carried Emily through countless storms, now curved slightly, but it remained just as steady as ever. "How many jars do you think I've written by now?" Emily asked when the two of them paused at the center of the bridge. Richard narrowed his eyes like he was genuinely counting. "Close to 300, not even including the ones you've left at the library, the coffee shop, or the post office." Emily smiled. "I think I'll keep going. I don't think you owe anything to anyone anymore," he said. "It's not a debt, Dad. It's just, I know there are still kids out there standing on bridges like I once did, and they don't have to jump, not if someone's willing to stand beside them, even if it's just through one written line." Richard said nothing. Words like these, he had heard them many times from his daughter, but they never failed to move him. People often say a father's love is silent, but for Richard, just seeing his daughter live a life of kindness was already the loudest answer of all. Emily placed the new jar in the familiar crevice between the rocks. The bridge had changed a bit over the years, repaired several times after storms, but the small spot where she always left her letters still remained as if nature itself had grown accustomed to the ritual and refused to erase it. "Did you know a kid found one of the jars last year?" Emily said. "They left a new one in return, all scribbly handwriting, but there was one line I'll never forget. It said, 'Thank you, stranger. Because of you, I finally told my mom I want a hug every day.'" Richard exhaled like something had been stuck in his chest for a lifetime and had finally been released. "That child may never remember your name," he said quietly, "but they'll always remember someone once listened." In a small corner of the house, once Emily's bedroom, there was now a community reading space. She hadn't opened the cafe she used to joke about when she was 16, nor had she become the novelist she once dreamed of. Emily had become a social worker, but more precisely, She had become someone who leaves glass jars in the middle of life in the form of letters, books, listening, and being present without judgment. 2 old photographs still hung on the wall, one of her birth mother, who gave her life, and one of Richard, the man who held on to that life when Emily thought she had nothing left to cling to. She once said, "No one needs to know what I've been through, but if my survival helps someone else, then my past wasn't meaningless." On Emily's 19th birthday, Richard gave her a new picture frame. In the photo, she was sitting among a group of children at a shelter holding a small girl in her arms, head bent in a laugh. "I think you should hang it next to my photo," he said. Emily laughed. "So you're saying you're a celebrity now?" "No, just someone lucky that I didn't give up so I got to see you like this." She didn't say anything more. She took the frame and walked to the wall, placing it between the 2 older photos right in the center, as if at last everything had come together to tell a complete story. Some bridges may seem like nothing more than narrow crossings, but they carry the weight of entire lifetimes. The story of Emily and Richard is not merely one of reunion between father and daughter. It is proof of something greater, that no matter how dark life becomes, love, if patient and sincere, can still illuminate the places thought to be beyond saving. The wicked may hurt others in silence, but time and conscience will always pass the final verdict. And the good, no matter how often they are knocked down by life, will find their light again, as long as they keep walking and offer part of their warmth to others. Richard had once lost everything, but because he didn't let go when Emily needed him most, he was given the chance to be a father again, to live again. To you, dear aunts, sisters, and women of strength and experience, I ask from the heart. Have you ever held on to a pain in silence because you didn't know who to share it with? Have you ever chosen to forgive not because someone deserved it, but because you wanted peace? As women, sometimes all it takes is one look of trust to help us rise from the ruins. I hope that each of you watching this video, especially you, dear sister, will always have someone who's willing to sit beside you on your hardest days. And today, how are you feeling? Are you doing okay? If there were a glass jar in front of you now, what would you write inside? Please share it with me. This channel is always here to listen with sincerity. See you in the next story.